Thank you. So before I get started, just kind of tell you a little bit about the goals or my goals for tonight. I want to give hopefully enough details to where the budget makes sense, put it in a way that makes sense, but it's not necessarily too deep in the weeds to confuse. Just basically kind of give an outline of where we're at. Talk about the other considerations that have really taken into account in terms of the budget. Um, Talk about the things that we've already discussed prior to this point, and hopefully just be able to answer some of the questions. I know, myself being in this district for 13 years prior to my current position, a lot of the questions that I always had, along the way. So hopefully I'll be able to answer quite a few of those tonight through this. So one of the things that we've talked about, honestly, the last couple years that, I've heard this term, everybody's heard this term, is a structural deficit. We're in a structural deficit. We're in a structural deficit. Well, what is that? So in simplistic terms, a structural deficit is where our expenses outweigh our revenues on an ongoing basis. And so I mentioned this term here, a base budget. I'm going to break that down a little bit here in a couple slides of what I mean. But school funding or any funding really, can have its challenges, and how the accounting works and how things end up on paper and what it looks like on paper is not always the true story. But at the end of the day, our expenses and the revenues that we know that we can count on, the revenues are not enough to cover our current expenses or projected ones. For us in our district, unfortunately, historically, we've relied on what we consider one-time funds, additional funding from the state, or in the case of this year, we got some federal help, some dollars to help with the pandemic. So those would be considered one-time funds, where we get them in 1 year, but we cannot count on them in future years. And typically they're what we call restricted, meaning that it can only be used for certain purposes. Any surplus has also been used to cover the deficit. So while we've been able to get by in most years, I know as long as I've been here, this has been an ongoing conversation, and hopefully it's something that we can remedy moving forward. Now, the speed at which this conversation has happened really has, we've had some impacts recently, some pretty significant increases in our expenses that really have further impacted the deficit. And like I said, kind of sped up this process of, hey, this is really something that we need to take a look at. Now, I will tell you, the ones that I'm going to list here, much like, the idea of consolidating a school or any other solution that we've come up with, there's no one solution. There's no one silver bullet. Much like with these recent expenses, there's not one of them that has put us in the spot. There's not one that's to blame. There's not one that if we didn't have it, it would fix everything. It's really a combination of all these, but I want to show you kind of how they've really kind of piled up into the spot that we're in. I know one item that has come up kind of year after year is our non-public school or our SCO costs. I think it's really important to understand that these kids are still kids in our district, and we have to serve them. Unfortunately, because of the size of our district, we don't always have the opportunity or the resources to be able to provide the programs that these kids need. So these kids, they can't be served at Annalee, they can't be served at Laguna, they can't be served at El Molino. And so we have to find a place for them. And again, they are ours, they're our student district or our school district. So these costs, tend to run a little high. In 18-19, there was a pretty significant increase in this particular category. If you remember, if you were part of the conversations last year with the reductions that we made, one of those was a SCO class take back. So Laura Schmidt has done a great job getting our positive engagement program class going this year, where we've been able to grab a couple of those students, a handful of those students that would be going to SCO, and we're able to serve them on our campus. So it's reducing the costs that we spend to SCO. It's shifting them into our budget. So there's a cost to serve those students. But it's going towards our staff currently, and obviously the goal is to continue that improvement. Transportation is another one that I think everybody knows. We've talked a lot about it in terms of, is this something that we could cut? We talked about, and we cut the annually routes to try to get some cost savings in 17-18. And again, all these are really within the last 3 years. In 17-18, we had a pretty big increase of about 240,000. It's been discussed before, but I'll mention it again. We're part of a JPA, which means we have shared costs among other school districts at that year or in that year. Santa Rosa City Schools joined. And so what happens is it takes about 3 to 5 years for those expenses to kind of transition to where each school district is paying theirs. So as it turned out, our school district got hit a little heavier than most, but in an upside, I guess, is that since that point in time, from 2017-18 till now, the transportation costs have only increased a total of 4%. So one of the items that we've talked about is getting savings, or we've been expecting savings. And I think our savings is coming from the fact right now that our transportation costs are not rising. So, I do know that West County Transportation Agency has given salary increases. They did some facilities improvements that get shared among everybody. So there were costs that went up. And I think the fact that our number is not rising at that percentage is a show of the savings that we were expecting. Another one that is really, nobody would really know, but property and liability insurance has been a big hit. From a percentage standpoint, it's almost tripled. It's gone up 178% in the last 3 years. So really that last 3-year timeline is since we had the fires in October of 2017. The rates have gone up tremendously. It was $147,000 for our school district. This year, as you'll see later on in the slide, it's about $410,000. So we've had a $260,000 increase just in property and liability insurance. Much like with transportation, we were part of a JPA, RESIG, and they do their job to go out and try to get us the most affordable insurance. The trouble is that providers, they view Sonoma County as a risk, clearly so. And so there's less providers, higher premium, and it does end up, getting spread out to everybody else. We won't be the only one, in this spot. However, we did have a big increase. The next thing is as everybody knows, we've had salary increases over the last 2 and 3 years. These are going to have an impact on our long-term budget. I wanted to kind of break it out so you guys could see and be transparent about each of the categories and what the impact is. So really these numbers here that I say is an increase. It's if we were to take a look at what the salaries are going to be after the raises make their way through, what would they have been without any raises? And this is the difference. And so ultimately what happens is on an ongoing basis, we have these additional costs as well. And finally, in the recent years, and this one goes back a little bit further, but from 2014-15, about 6 years ago, the STRS and PERS contributions on the district side have nearly doubled. And the only reason they haven't doubled yet is part of the governor's budget package this year was to basically provide extra money to pay down some of the percentages. But as you can see, it was, the STRS contribution for the district was 8.8% just 6 years ago. It is now 16.15. In 2 years, it's expected to be at its cap at 18.1. And that's provided that they don't change any legislation. At the end of the day, they're going to fund STRS. So, that could have a potential impact. PERS is in that same boat where it has jumped from 11.77% to currently we're at 20.7, and it's going to go up another 5% in the next couple of years. So again, there's not one of these that has, you could say, okay, well, if that wasn't there, we would be fixed. It's really been a combination of these that we've had in these last 3 years. And they're really just kind of culminating. So if we have expenses that are rising and we have potential revenue that's decreasing, then we're in a tough spot. Jeannie, do I see your hand?
Can you please explain to people what STRS and PERS is? Many people don't know what that is.
Great question. Thank you. I'm sorry. So STRS is the State Teachers Retirement System. And so obviously that's where the retirement system that our that covers most of the certificated staff, and PERS is the Public Employees Retirement System. So if you work for a city or a county, you're likely part of PERS. So this is the retirement system from the state that is the other employees that are not the teachers. Thank you, Jeannie. So really, this is our what leads to our structural deficit. All right. So where does that leave us? All right. So I mentioned earlier the idea of this base budget, and I'm going to compare it to the adopted budget. So when I present the adopted budget on paper and in a spreadsheet, we have all these numbers, and then we have revenue and we have expenses and all that. But I really want to kind of break down what it is and really why am I concerned? Why am I concerned moving forward? So if you look back at the 45-day revision, you'll notice in our total revenue category, it looks like we're expected to get about $28.7 million this year. Now, this revenue is everything. It's our state funding, which is called the LCFF, is called the Local Control Funding Formula. It's property taxes, it's the supplemental grant, it's parcel taxes, it's money from the federal government, it's any grants that we have written that support some of our programs, like our CTE incentive grant, all of that. It's all considered revenue. And so that goes into this number. But when we take a little deeper look, one part is we get an allocation from the state for transportation to the tune of about $530,000. And so what happens is this shows up as a revenue, and then it immediately goes out as a corresponding expense. So as part of our LCFF, the local control funding formula, as part of that calculation, they give us $500,000, and it's not even cash. We can't even say we got it and then we turned around. It's a line item on our balance sheet. Again, it comes in as a revenue. It goes out to the JPA as an expense. I'm going to talk about that later on. But it's really not money that we get, right? We don't get to use this money. Then the STRS, the State Teachers Retirement System, it's called an on behalf payment. So the state will also, or has recently, contributed extra to STRS to help offset some of the needed costs. And basically it's additional money that goes into the program, the retirement system, on behalf of the employees. And this is another, what I consider a paper revenue. It shows up as income, it shows up as revenue, but we don't see it, we don't touch it, it just ends up in our books and it goes out as an expense, right? So really there's about 1.4 million out of this 28.7 that is only on paper. We really don't get to use this at all. So the next thing I wanted to look at, again, is we got a subtotal, right? So we're really kind of starting our year with about 27 million, give or take. And unique to this year, we have this one-time funding that I mentioned earlier. So LLMF stands for Learning Loss Mitigation Funds. And, part of that first package, when we got, everybody got the $1,200 checks or whatever, the additional money for unemployment, part of that package, the CARES Act, was to give money to states, and our state decided to use a lot of it to kind of bridge the funding gap for schools. Now, the catch is we only get what we spend, and for the majority of it, about 1.1, we have to spend it by December 30th. So this is money that, again, is going to show up as a revenue, but the only way we're going to get the full 1.3 million is if we spend 1.3 million. So no matter what we get here, it's going to be what I call a net zero. So we're going to get money in and we're going to have corresponding expenses that go out. So in this particular year, our revenue is going to look a lot higher than normal, and our expenses are going to look higher than normal because of this. Now, another thing that's unique to this year is that we have a parcel tax kind of overlap, right? So we have one parcel tax that is ending this year, and then we have another parcel tax that is beginning this year. So this expiring parcel tax revenue amounts to about 1.3, a little bit over 1.3 million. This is money that we won't have going forward, right? So when I look at the idea of what am I working with here, in projecting future years. Unfortunately, I can't count on one-time money. Will we get another relief package from the federal government? Possibly. Is the election going to play a role? Does it matter who's president when they play a role? Are they going to force one through? All of those things are possibilities, but it's not something that I can count on when it comes to looking forward. And you can't really cover your expenses or plan on covering your expenses with one-time money. Just as a practice, that's not something that the financial position of the school district, I would like us to be in a better position than that. Ultimately, the goal would be that one-time funding was kind of money that we had choices over. We could decide how we wanted to plan and use it instead of scrambling to cover expenses that we have to have. So for me, I kind of take a look at the budget and I say, you know what, really what we're starting with moving forward is we can kind of count on about $25 million, give or take. So what does that look like? Right. So if we start our base budget with a revenue of 25 million, out of any budget year, we have to by law withhold a 3% reserve. Right. This is our emergency reserve. This is essentially our emergency account. If you had a savings, this is untouchable other than in an emergency, and then you have to fill it up back up as soon as possible. So I made it a round number based on 3% of 25 million. That's why it's at 750. Unfortunately, sometimes all of those paper revenues that we get and paper expenses that we get, we have to count the 3% against those expenses as well. So our next big chunk, obviously our biggest expense is salaries, retirement contributions, what we call statutory costs, right? That's the Medicare, that's the Social Security, that's the unemployment. These numbers here, just like I took the learning loss mitigation funds money out of the revenue, I adjusted these numbers for the expenses that were associated with that. So I wanted to be fair in the sense of if we're not going to have revenue in future years, we're not going to have those expenses in future years. We added some academic support classes this year to manage that learning loss. I adjusted the STRS contributions for the money that the state gave us. So really, these are the expenses of the district. And you can see that $25 million gets down, almost 16 million in quite a hurry. So now we're down at about 8.7. After that, we have employee benefits, right? So we have benefits for those that are currently working, and we have health benefits that we pay to our retired staff as well as part of that agreement. So you can see this budget that we have to work with gets down to about 4.5 million. We have books and supplies that we obviously provide each year. This 750,000 is kind of an average over our last 5 years. Taking a look back, we have a lot higher expenses in this category this year because of those learning loss funds. And then we have service and operating expenses that this is adjusted. And I'm going to talk about the services budget in a couple slides here because that's been one of the questions that has come up as well, and rightly so. It's our by category, it's our second biggest line item expense. So I want to talk a little bit about what's in there, what does that do? But with that being said, this is where the transportation, expenditure comes from. That extra money from the state ends up as a services item. So I've adjusted all that out to take a look at what do we normally spend in this area. And as you can see, the math doesn't quite work out there when you only have 4.5 million left. Then you have expenses of 5.7. So when we talk about we're in a structural deficit, this is the way that I look at it, is that when you're not counting on the one-time money, when you're not counting on using up your savings to get through a year, can your current year revenue match and beat your current year expenses? And right now, we are at a deficit on an annual basis. And so I've talked at earlier meetings that the reason why we're getting through this year and the reason why we have a chance next year is because we have that additional parcel tax money. And this is why we're going to be running at a deficit, and we're going to run at a deficit again next year. And really, this is going to come to a culmination in year 3. And And really that's the crux of all of this, is that we have to provide plans within 3-year spans of how we can make it through all 3 years. Fundamentally speaking, though, this has been a conversation that's been ongoing forever. And I say forever, I'm just speaking of my time in the district. Um, it's always been a concern. Rising expenses, lowering revenue, something fundamentally has to change. Now, I did want to mention, right, there's some other budget considerations in addition to that. We do expect just certain expenses to increase, right? So step and column increases. All of our staff is paid on basically a table, and we call them steps and columns. So every year is a step, and then a lot of times based on education or whatever standing you're in, you move over columns and you move down this, and this is our salary increases throughout the year. So these are going to happen each and every year that we have them. So we have to plan for them moving forward. Um, Health benefits will increase, much like in the private sector, much like for all of you that have jobs outside education. Health benefits are health benefits. And, even at a 4% increase, which in certain years, that's a relatively safe number, that would impact us at about $185,000 a year based on our current premiums. Now, we're always looking to see if we can improve this number. But at the end of the day, we're going to be providing health benefits. This number is never going to be zero. So can we reduce it? Yes, we will always try to look, for the best way to do that. But it will always be an increasing expense. I mentioned earlier those contribution percentages. STRS is expected to go up 2% in the next 2 years, and PERS is expected to go up 3%, and then an additional 2 more after that. And then just overall operating costs. This is your PG&E, water, electricity covers in PG&E. Fortunately for us, we installed the solar quite some time ago, and without that, these costs would rise even more. So we get a tremendous amount of our energy from the solar that we have in place. That's really helped us curb these operating costs, but they will increase. They will increase. One thing that I did want to mention, in addition to declining enrollment, right? So declining enrollment has been mentioned, and that's one thing, right? Having less kids, and we can debate, back and forth whether it's going to speed up, whether it's there. The numbers tell us one thing, but we're also facing a declining percentage of attendance. And why that's important is because not only do we get paid on the number of kids, we get paid from the state based on how often they're in class. And so even just 5 years ago, or 3 years ago, I believe, our percentage of ADA, meaning, if our enrollment was, 1,800, we got credit. We captured 95% of them. And currently our percentage is down about 93, right? And so that might not seem like much, that we only get, it's only 2%. It's not a big drop. But 2% for us, based on our current enrollment, is about $350,000. So, as part of this conversation, yes, the talk about reductions and cuts and all that stuff, it gets tiring, and I totally understand that. So I do want to look, are there other ways that we can improve revenue? And this is a way, where revenue can be improved just from the standpoint of being in the classroom more often. Not only do you have the benefit of, more days learning, for the student, and it's absences for any reason, excused absences, unexcused absences. If they're not there, unfortunately, we don't get credit. And so that is something that we could make a push. I mean, obviously, we don't want kids to come to school sick. I'm concerned about this moving forward, to be quite honest, just because with the pandemic and with the concern about the health, I do worry that this number might drop in the future. Hopefully we can stem it. Hopefully we can grow it. This is another potential way where we can have some impact on our revenue, not just our expenses. Right? And I do also want to consider the possibility of Prop 15. I know that this is something that is big in certain areas of the community. And it has factored in, from the standpoint of our decisions. And when we're looking forward, I don't want you guys to think that we're not looking at other ways, like what could we do? I do want to be honest in the sense that I have some concerns about relying on Prop 15 at this point. And just a couple of them are, there is an uncertain amount of additional funding. So I know a lot of the information right now that I've seen out on Facebook or just through other circulations and whatnot, kind of identifies this number of 1.2 million for West Sonoma County, and that's what we would get. And I understand where that number came from because I get those same estimates, but I want to be clear that that 1.2 million is on the high side of the estimate that we were given. The low side of that estimate is about $670,000. And to be quite honest, I'm not sure that the state's range of what they're going to get in revenue is pretty big. I've seen numbers, around the 8-9 million. I've seen numbers around 15 billion that they think they're going to get. So they've kind of settled on 11.4. So it's hard to say that, yes, we're going to get 1.2 million from that. And it's also a proposition that I don't necessarily feel like is a slam dunk to pass. So to count on it right now, I don't think is necessarily the wisest thing. Would it help us? Absolutely. I think it'll help everybody. But in terms of doing prudent planning, do I think that it would be wise to bank on us getting it and making decisions based on that? I don't. Also, another hesitation that I have is the delay in implementation. So from everything that I understand, even if it does pass, if it makes it through legal challenges, if it's in force, it's still going to take time to assess properties. I've heard anywhere from 1 to 2 years. I've heard that the state assessor's office doesn't have enough assessors to kind of handle this job right now. So that it could take, upwards of 1 to 2 years to even get the property values assessed. Obviously, we know the big corporations, if it does pass, are going to fight those assessments. So really, it wouldn't start phasing in until about 22, 23, I think, in a good scenario. And it will not fully be implemented until 25, 26. And so for us, that's 5 years down the road. And so that's my hesitations. Again, I wanted to bring it up as a possibility. I want to be clear and transparent that yes, we do factor these things in terms of our future planning. But I also want to present the reasons why I can't, with 100% certainty say, yes, we can count on Prop 15 as additional revenue source. My ideal goal would be to fix our structural deficit problem. And that if Prop 15 does pass, then that gives us some additional funding that we could then make future choices on because our base budget is covered. I mentioned a little while back the services budget. Okay, and again, this has been questioned over the last few years, and rightly so. Like I said, by line item, it's our second biggest budget category, roughly about 5 billion. It seems to increase. There's not a lot of clarity, or there hasn't been a lot of clarity behind it. So I hope to provide that in this. So things that go in our services budget are pretty much anything that we either one don't handle in-house as far as our employees handle. So a lot of the services we offer kids, they end up here. When we go to mileage for conferences, going to conferences themselves, any legal costs, election costs, any of those types of items that come from just running a school district, they end up in the services budget. But I did want to highlight really our biggest ones, and you're going to see by the end of this, just the expenditures that I'm going to show you on this page account for 90% of the expenditures in this budget from last year. And I can explain the other 10%. I just didn't want to bore you with all those minutia details. So we talked before about our SCO and our NPS costs. Again, I do want to reiterate, these are our students. We do have to serve these students, whether it's by law, IDEA, or the fact that that is just our job in education is to provide the services that the students need. A lot of these are the individualized plans. So it doesn't make sense, or it's not financially feasible to offer the program needs that these students have, because there's not enough of them and we're not big enough, right? We're not an LA Unified, we're not in Oakland, we're not that where there's so many of them that you can create a program. So some of these students, we just have no choice. Again, are we always monitoring this and continuing? Yes, Laura Schmidt's doing a great job of getting things in place. I'm working hand in hand with her in terms of figuring out ways to curb costs. How can we add additional supports at the site level, at the district level, so that way we can serve some of these kids, the ones that are maybe on the fringe. Can we provide additional services? We call them tier 1, 2, 3 wraparound services. So can we provide more so that we don't have kids that have to go to these others? But we're always going to have kids that we can't serve. The next, big ticket item that ends up in the services budget is home to school transportation. Again, this is the adjusted number after I take out the number that the state gives us, that $530,000. We have that property and liability insurance that ends up in this category as well. As I mentioned before, it's about a little over $400,000 this year. And it will it continue to increase? Likely, as long as we keep having fires. One thing I forgot to mention, there's a statute of limitations law or statute of limitations that got removed for abuse cases. So that is added to the risk. So this premium looks to keep climbing. We get what are called supplemental grant dollars, and so there's a certain population in our student body, roughly about 30% by numbers, that qualifies for funding from the supplemental grant for the state. These are our foster youth, economically disadvantaged students that we get additional funding for, but much like a lot of funding, it comes with strings in the sense that we have to provide services, or the goal is to provide services for those students. So Tony will typically, in most years, will present the LCAP, right? This year it was either the new LCAP or the LCP. That's where a lot of these dollars end up in the services budget, because we contract with outside services or outside sources to provide those services to the students. So all of these here are still student-centered services, but they end up in the services budget. We have our normal operational costs, garbage, water, sewer, electricity, gas. So when we talk about what might be the operational savings, and we pick the number of 200,000, roughly, I took this number and I took about 2/3, with the idea that we would still need, there would still be operating costs, even if a site was not being used. So if you wonder where that number came from, basically it came from here. We have repairs and maintenance. I didn't mention early on that we have to put 3% into a reserve, our minimum reserve. We also have to contribute 3% to what's called routine restricted maintenance. And so we have expenditures that come out of that account, and we basically have to refill that every single year to that 3% level. We have additional transportation that is specific to special ed. That's in addition to our home to school transportation. Last year, right, when I'm looking at 1920, we had a teacher at El Molino that was a CTE teacher, and his contract was through SCO. So technically, even though he was a teacher in our district teaching our kids, we paid SCO for his contract, and therefore that ends up in the services budget. We will not have this year, this year, so we should see a reduction, or will see a reduction from that. Last year, we also had a school resource officer that was out at El Molino. So his salary was paid to the Sonoma County Sheriff's Department. It was paid through a grant, right? So that was money where that grant was specifically for the school resource officer and the campus supervisors that we had at Annalee. And so that's revenue that we wouldn't have gotten if we didn't have a school resource officer. And it's an expense that we wouldn't have had if we didn't have a school resource officer. So it shows up here as an expense, But again, it was paid through a grant. It was not paid through our general fund dollars other than on paper. We have our Admentum program, which is what we use for summer school and independent study. And then, we have our phone and our internet and our postage. And so when you total all these up, these things here account for, like I said, roughly 90% of the expenditures that end up in the services budget. So, an argument that can be made, or likely or reasonably is made, is, well, why don't we just cut the services budget? Why don't we cut 2 million out of there? Why does it have to be this? Well, all of these are things that, for the most part, we can't not provide, right? So, can we try to reduce our fee for service at SCO? Absolutely. Can we try to reduce the number of kids that end up at non-public school? Absolutely. Can we try to reduce transportation? Sure, but at some point it's going to flatten out. There's some stuff that we can't do anything about. But at the end of the day, we have to provide some level of these services. So they're really, when we say that there's not anything left to cut, this is part of why. The ones with the asterisks by them, I just wanted to make a note that a lot of these are people-based, right? So these are programs, and these are counselors, and these are other teachers, and these are psychologists, and these are salaries that if we were big enough to provide them in our school district, that they would be expenditures that would actually end up in our salaries and benefits category. But because we pay them to outside sources, again, they show up as a services line item expense. One of the questions that was asked at the last meeting is, okay, what else has been considered? And again, another great question, because we didn't just land here at closing a school. I was, I started as a teacher, so I was part of the superintendent's budget committee as a teacher. Obviously, I've transitioned into this position as well, and it's been an ongoing discussion. But we have made reductions from last year's plan. Right, we did have that SCO program take back. We looked at stuff like changing our dental and vision provider to see if we could pick up some savings there, which we did. We eliminated bus routes. As many of you know, unfortunately, we eliminated positions. And I can tell you, there's just a continual review of the budget. This is going to be an ongoing conversation, always. And so to say that any of these are just cut and dry right now, I won't say that. I will continue to review it, but at the same time, there is a certain level of service that we have to provide. Other big picture items that were talked about before we got to this point, we discussed the 6-period day, and that was a big conversation. We brought up moving Laguna to the Elmo campus. That was another big conversation. We've talked about changing benefit providers. That's not a decision that we can make unilaterally. We've discussed becoming a basic aid district, and determined that the numbers just do not support that. The number of our property taxes, which would be our funding source, our main funding source, would not be sufficient. We're in a better financial position getting money from the state. And then obviously the unification of partner districts that will be down the road. So when it comes to school closures, or the potential for one, it's not one that just was pulled out of a hat. We had tried to kind of go through a bunch of other options before that. And then obviously we talked about this last time. I think the question was brought up, why would you do it? I mean, building a new school is just not realistic. Like, so to say, okay, let's just build a new campus and we'll put everybody there and we'll start a new school, that would most definitely need a bond measure of a substantial amount. And one, it wouldn't pass. Two, it would not be fair to ask to pass. So no, building a new school is not really a feasible option for us. And ultimately, why we're having this discussion is based on the budget predictions, and the state funding level is set to not give us, a cost of living adjustment over the next 2 years. Even if we got a cost of living adjustment, even if we got a 2.5% cost of living adjustment, that would be enough to cover our step and column salary increases that I mentioned before, and the associated costs and any benefit increases. And that would be it. like that would take up the whole amount. And we still have all those other expenses that would be increasing. So based on our adopted budget and ultimately our 45-day revision, the Sonoma County Office of Education is requiring a board approved fiscal recovery plan. So regardless of what option we choose, we have to come up with a plan to identify a minimum, again, based on current projections, a minimum of $2 million in reductions and or revenue increase. Right? It could be a combination of the two by the fiscal year 2022-23. So for us, that's 2 years out. Next school year, it's the school year after that. With the current information regarding future revenue, again, you know, I've mentioned at past meetings that I'm even more concerned about the funding for 22-23. I think that the pandemic is lasting longer than a lot of people thought. I think a lot of people are out of work a lot longer than they thought. Maybe even the state, because so much of our revenue at a state level comes from income taxes and not having the incomes to support that. I do think it's wise to be hesitant about what that future funding might look like. Now, again, could Prop 15 pass? Yes. Will we factor it in if it does? Absolutely. Could we get another package from the federal government? Yes. Will we factor that in if it does? Absolutely. But without 100% confirmation of that, based on the current information we have, the way I see it to get to the $2 million in 2 years is one of two ways, right? And again, this is without any other options that we've discussed, but we could plan consolidation of campuses for the 22-23 school year. And we would have to continue to review all of our other options to try to save an additional $800,000 over that time frame. So whether it's 400 next year and 400 the year after that, that would do it. That's one path to get there. Another path to get there, and again, is obviously a hastier plan, but this is just financially speaking, is to plan consolidation of the campuses for the 21-22 school year, in which case we would achieve the estimated savings over the next 2 years. So, and I will say that, that estimated number, we run a couple different plans. We have estimations on the high side of that. We have estimations a little bit on the low side of that. So I do want to be safe. I'm not saying, just like I said with Prop 15, this is not what I think our maximum savings could be. And so if it's anything less than it is, I do think there's a little bit more in there that could be gotten. And obviously, with everybody's points that you guys have brought up over the last few meetings, could we have expenditures that are more than we think? Yes, that is definitely a possibility. Now, either way, in my opinion, no matter what option is chosen, whether it's consolidation of schools, whether it's any other choice that we've come up with prior to now, continuous review, discussion, and honestly planning of what's down the road is going to be needed. Like I said, my goal is ultimately to fix the base budget. And when we get the extra money, we get the one-time money, we get additional funding from the state, things are better, then that's extra for us. And we don't have to worry about going backwards or covering, past expenses. That would be my goal. Is that possible? That's yet to be determined. But in my outlook, that would be the main thing that I'm trying to accomplish. Oops. So Tony, this one's.
So first of all, I just want to say thank you. I've been in education for a little while, and I don't think I've ever heard that clear of an explanation of a budget before. So I appreciate your clearness in describing the situation that we're in. So this is our last slide before we start to take questions. So in the conclusions that we've made from the presentations that we've had over the last, beginning October 7th, is that what we know is that all of our students in our district could fit onto one campus. If you compare the other Sonoma County high school sizes in the county, our combined campuses would have a smaller size than many of the Sonoma County public schools. We do know too that our budget realities do not leave many other options for achieving the reductions that are being required for us by the Sonoma County Office of Education and our budget realities. So even consolidating the schools is not going to solve our budget problem. And we also know that if the board were to make a decision to consolidate and make that decision sooner rather than later, it would allow us to address our budget and program issues sooner.